Can you break down jazz for me? If someone has never heard of jazz before, has no idea of the concept of the music, how is a jazz set structured? What are the different recurring elements? How does one first approach jazz?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's very individualized in terms of how people come to jazz or be introduced to that. I don't have a formula for saying this is what you should do. Yeah. But I think that I speak often to audiences that have very little experience with jazz. Mm-hmm. And what I find is that going back to its roots and its history gives me the key on how to introduce it to them. So let's just think about the history of this music. Okay. Right? The first recording was in 1917. It was an all-white band from New Orleans because they weren't recording that many black musicians at that time. And it was the original Dixieland jazz band, they called themselves, even though they were basically very good musicians, but they were just imitating the black musicians and Creole musicians that they were also hearing. So it wasn't like they were creating jazz, but they were really good at mimicking that. And they were a very important group because it was the first group. Black musicians started recording several years later, and they eventually would outsell these guys. But what was happening in the world in 1917? There were two major forces at play. Well, there was more than two, but there was two important ones. The first one is that the recording industry as we know it today was being formulated. In other words, think about recordings, mass distribution, objects you could sell, people could possess, selling technology, record players, for them to play this technology on. The second thing is we were right on the cusp of the last global pandemic, the Spanish flu. So when they recorded this record and they billed it as the new thing, it was precisely at the moment that these record companies were trying to figure out how to go global with this mass mediation. Mm-hmm. It was also precisely at the time that all live performance venues shut down. That means that no one could consume music unless they owned records, and they would play them in their own homes. So it was like perfect storm that allowed jazz to be the newest thing that just came out right at the moment where no one could see live music. Perfect for marketing. So jazz started outselling a lot of the other music that was being recorded. In 1919, the world started opening up. It was the first time where people could go see live music. So that original Dixieland jazz band took a tour around the United States, playing all the music that was on that record, and they toured to Europe and Asia. By 1920, every single city that they stopped in had local musicians playing iterations of this music. In other words, this music went viral way before that word was associated with anything positive. And it was out of circumstance because it was the music that was the sound of hope, of new beginning. It was a new sound. It was unique. There had been pre-jazz musicians that had toured into these places, but didn't sound quite the way that these guys sounded. Why was it that it could translate across these huge cultural divides? What was it about the music that people found compelling, besides it being the new and improved thing? And what I think that is that early jazz musicians centered improvisation at the heart of this music. Now, jazz is not the only music that's improvised. There's a lot of music traditions around the world that are improvised. But when we say improvisation, what do we mean, really? We mean spontaneously made, interaction with context, adapting to the moment. When I ask folks who are not jazz fans if they improvise, they think, yeah, I guess occasionally. And I said, no, you don't. You actually improvise thousands of times a day. Because what is the definition of improvisation? I always tell this story. You had to walk here today. You crossed a major thoroughfare in New York City. You stepped onto the street. You looked one way. It was clear. You looked the other way, and a bus was coming. What did you do? Improvised, which might mean like take off and run really fast across the street, or jump back, or stare like a deer in headlights and start praying that the bus driver has the ability to improvise and swerve around them. It's adaptability. Mm-hmm. It's the fundamental survival skills of all human beings. We all improvise. And not only that, we thrive off improvisation. In every single conversation we have, if something sparks our interest or is a surprise, we're immediately connected to that other person. It's the way that we connect. It's the bright moments of the day. That's the reason why this music resonated with everyone, because it's a universal that human beings have fundamental survival skills. Every human being improvises every single day, even if they're one of those people that are control freaks and are planning everything, they still are forced to improvise because our context constantly changes. And I focus in on that. I said, all jazz is the sounding out of that everyday process. It's like having a conversation and someone surprises you and you go, tell me more. And that's what musicians do when we look at each other and we smile. Someone has just done that. We also, it's so tied intrinsically to group interaction. I also talk about jazz as a circle dance. So, like many traditions around the world, especially at weddings, people get around in a circle and one person at a time takes turns getting in the center and usually dancing badly, but everybody else cheers them on, right? That's what it's like taking a solo in a jazz band, where everybody in the community gets a voice and gets a moment to tell their story. And the rest of the community standing around amplifies their story, either by cheering them on or interacting with them. That's what jazz is. And that's simply, especially small group jazz, right? Where you have 4, 5, 6 people interacting on stage, spontaneously trying to create something beautiful right before your very eyes and negotiating that. It's like listening in to a conversation. And as soon as I can get people to start to understand that, they're usually hooked. They may not be jazz fans for the rest of their lives, but they walk away with an understanding. So what does that mean? If it's a small group jazz thing, there's going to be improvisation. There's going to be communication and collective improvisation, a negotiation of sound. They're going to use music like a language and speak to one another with a calmer grammar and calmer structures, just like we do when we speak in a language. And so as long as everybody in that band has language competency, some beautiful things can happen.